Today's lecture, we are going to start talking about the historic period, early historic period. So the early dynasties in Chinese history are known as the Three Dynasties, 三代. The Three Dynasties of Xia, Shang, and Zhou. So these are the spelling of these three dynasties. It's might not be exactly the way that you would like to pronounce these, or if you hear me pronouncing Xia, Shang, and Zhou, you might think of a different way to write about it. But this is the current kind of official way of Romanizing these Chinese names using the pinyin system. So this is also widely adopted in your textbook, in the articles you read. So they pronounce the Xia, Shang, and Zhou, Zhou almost like J-O-E, that Zhou, that kind of pronunciation. So you guys have discussed excellently the major ways that scholars got to know architecture from the three dynasties. So we have history, we have written record, we have archaeology to acquire data from archaeological excavation. And we also have study of art history, looking at images carved on the surface of bronze vessel or painted on mural, or other images, and sometimes also models, right? Models, small architectural models buried in the tomb, so the ancient imagery. And there is another one called paleography. That is something that I'm going to introduce today. Paleography is the study of ancient script, old words, because Chinese language is not alphabetical, it's not recording the pronunciation. Rather, each Chinese character is almost like a small picture. So the picture sometimes looks like the thing it is describing. So sometimes by study old characters, we might get some, insight into the thing being depicted back then. So if we specifically look at architectural vocabularies, we might know something. So that is called paleography, the study of old words, old language, or old script. So these are the ways we acquire information about architecture. So the three dynasties, somewhere 4,000 years ago, that is the threshold between prehistory and history in the Chinese civilizations. The Xia dynasty is still somewhat legendary. Not every scholar in the world agree there is a Xia dynasty. In another word, it is not archaeologically confirmed. So we haven't found a widely accepted site, or better, the capital of the Xia dynasty. But Chinese history, ever since the the first official kind of Chinese history, the historical record by Sima Qian of the first century BCE, have been talking about a Xia dynasty. And this dynasty was believed to have been existed from about 2000 BCE to about 1600 BCE. And after the Xia Dynasty is the Shang Dynasty, and the Shang Dynasty is archaeologically confirmed because a archaeological site in modern day Anyang is confirmed as the last capital of the Shang Dynasty, and various other sites had been identified as a Shang city or Shang capital. So since Shang Dynasty, there is no question, you know, the central authority start to be more and more exerting itself to the control of the heartland of Chinese civilization, especially the middle and lower Yellow River area. And the last of the three early dynasties, the Zhou dynasty, roughly from the mid 11th century BCE to the mid 3rd century BCE. So this dynasty has been very well documented. And this dynasty is also one of the kind of golden ages in Chinese civilization. You know, those great philosophers, religion founders of ancient China were living and active in the Zhou dynasty. For example, Confucius. Confucius lived in the 6th to 5th century BCE, in the middle part of the Zhou dynasty. A subdivision of Zhou dynasty known as the Spring and Autumn period. And that period is from the 8th century BCE to the 5th century BCE. And another great philosopher, Lao Tzu, is believed to be a contemporary of Confucius. So they were all from this period. This period also coincide with the kind of classical period in ancient Greece and ancient India. So we know that in ancient Greece and India, so during this period, great philosophers were born and preaching in their land, like Socrates and Plato in Greece, and Buddha or Gautama Siddhartha in India, etc. So this period, basically the first millennium BCE, we know much better in terms of textual information, if not regarding the physical remains of architecture. So one thing we need to be aware is that the territories of the three dynasties are not exactly the same, and their centers are also kind of shifting. For example, the Xia Dynasty, we don't know much about its territory because, as I said, Xia Dynasty has not been fully confirmed by archaeology yet. But you know, certain site that had been identified with the Xia Dynasty is primarily located in the western part of the Chinese heartland, in Shanxi province, for example, and also in Henan province, so in this area. And the Shang Dynasty, we know slightly better. Its heartland moved a little bit to the east, to the area of Zhengzhou and Anyang, to this area. And the Zhou dynasty, interestingly, originated from further western area and into the Shanxi province, this area. and its capital city is near modern-day city of Xi'an. So their heartland are shifting, but seems like the center of all three dynasties are primarily in the north, in the Yellow River areas. During the Zhou dynasty, the so-called civilized realm expanded much further into the north as well as into the south, especially into the south, probably incorporating the local cultures, which already had great civilizations, even though they were not recorded as extensively as the Yellow River area, because recent archaeology had revealed that the Yangtze River area also yield extensive urban heritage. There were foundations and sizable settlements excavated from those area. Yeah, if you look at this map, the Zhou is spelled as Chou here. So if you are reading books published slightly earlier, you might find a different romanization of the same Chinese term. I hope you can figure out what it is compared to our current spelling. Right, so Chou equals the Zhou. That's the same term, basically. So compared to the current map of China, that area is small. It's only about this part, right? The eastern part, eastern coastal area. So the provinces that I just mentioned briefly, for example, Shanxi province and Henan and Western Henan province, these are the heartland of the Xia Dynasty. And Eastern Henan province, that is the heartland of eastern and northern part of Henan province. That's the heartland of the Shang Dynasty. And the Zhou Dynasty, the capital is in the western province of Shanxi, this one, right? So, so far, these are the provinces. So you guys should gradually kind of familiar with these provinces where the early civilizations emerge, right? The Shanxi province for Xia Dynasty, Henan province for Shang Dynasty, and the Shanxi province for the Zhou Dynasty. So they are all kind of from the slightly western area, not exactly on the coast yet. These early dynasties regarding their locations. Even though the Xia Dynasty was not archaeologically confirmed, many Chinese scholars believed the discovery at Arlitou was a Xia Dynasty site. This is the name of the small village where extensive foundations, architectural foundations had been discovered. They are in the Henan province and from a small village called Arlitou. So a lot of Chinese scholars believe this is a Xia Dynasty site. So at Arlitou, together with the foundations and the remains of architecture, big ceramic, big potteries, and some bronze vessel, especially the drinking vessel known as Jue, had been discovered there. So Arlitou is an archaeological site that is at the threshold of kind of Stone Age and Bronze Age. So some bronze had been discovered here, but not as many as other sites that are identified with the Shang Dynasty. So it seems that here is the beginning of the kind of Bronze Age, and the carbon dating put it somewhere around 2000 BCE, and that is the time frame of the Xia Dynasty. So whether it is the Xia Dynasty, there is a question mark. It really depends on who you ask. In general, Chinese scholars believe it is a Xia Dynasty. Scholars in Europe, in America, they had a big question mark there. They thought that this might still belong to the kind of Neolithic age, whether it is a Xia Dynasty site. There is a question mark there. But from the architectural remains, we do see a lot of similarities between the layout of Arlitou complexes with characteristic features of traditional Chinese architecture, as we know from the last 2000 years. So it demonstrates features that would become standard for palatial Chinese architecture. For example, the use of wall to delineate a courtyard, right? So this is one of the very consistent feature of traditional Chinese architecture. The Chinese word for city and wall are the same. So they are called the cheng. So in another word, in the Chinese mind, if a city has no wall, if a architectural complex has no delineating enclosing wall, then it is not justified as a city or as a settlement complex. Indeed, at Arlitou, two major complexes had been excavated. One is numbered Palace number 1. Another is called the Palace number 2, right? Whether or not these complexes are palace for the ruler is a different question, all right? So just for convenience, we refer to them as Palace number 1 and Palace number 2. Some scholars believe these are not residential palaces. They are actually more for religious purposes, for ritual purposes, more religious than residential, but that's a different question. We will just, for our convenience, we call them Palace number 1, Palace number 2. Both Palace number 1 and Palace number 2 have a courtyard delineated by wall, right? Palace number 2 is more completely excavated. Palace number 1 had been, damaged. There was quite some reconstruction and educated guess to complete this drawing. But there is no question both of them feature courtyards. And both palaces also has a gate that is located at the southern end of the courtyard enclosure, right? So first the courtyard, and secondly, there are gates, and there is a major gate at one end of the courtyard. So here, palace number 2, we have this gate. Palace number 1, we have that gate. And that gate, the location of the main gate is on the southern end of the courtyard, right? So that arrow indicates north. That one indicate north. So that's on the south location. So that brings about the third feature, that is the orientation. In both cases, the complex is oriented along a north-south axis, right? Kind of a north-south orientation. The main element of the complex can be lined up by a north-south axis. And so that's the third characteristic, southern orientation. And number 4, in each courtyard, there is one big building, a major building located inside the courtyard. And in both cases, the main building, let's call it the hall, the main hall. In both cases, the main hall is located toward the northern part of the courtyard, so that its main facade is the southern facade, all right? The building is located in the north, so imagine the gathering of people in the courtyard would be in this space to the south of the main building. And in that way, when they look at the building, they are looking at the southern facade, right? So in another word, the southern facade is the main facade of the building. It is the face. It is facing people. It is to be looked at. In another word, the northern part could be understood at the back, right? Because there aren't that much space behind it. And if you are standing there, you are too close to the building, you won't see the whole face. So let's call that the back. So there is a southern orientation, a preference of southern orientation in both cases, right? So that's number 4. Number 5, there's some kind of a symmetry in the planning, right? Clearly there is a symmetry. The main building has a symmetry. The main building is a rectangular, showing the long face to the main space. And same is palace number 1. And the symmetry of the complex is also strengthened by the framing structures. In palace number 2, there are corridors. So pits for columns had been excavated here just next to the solid wall, and they are framing the central space symmetrically, right? There are these veranda surrounding the courtyard, giving symmetry to that space. Same thing can be said to palace number 1, right? There are corridors, and the main building is also symmetrical. And the main building is more or less lined up with the main gate that make an imagined axis possible. So this building, even though it is very early, it displays a lot of characteristic features of future Chinese architecture. So that's the only Shang Dynasty, Xia Dynasty example that I wanted to show you. When we get to talk about the Shang Dynasty, we know a lot more detail, partially because we have the Maurico Bone from the Shang Dynasty. All right. Shang Dynasty people ask God and ask their ancestor to tell them what to do, what not to do, what is auspicious, what is inauspicious. So they write their question on the bone and shells. The bones are usually the ox shoulder blade, like that. And the shells are usually turtle shell. So they write their question and then they heat it. And when the bone and shell crack, the way those crack develop and their relationship to the inscribed characters were telling them whether the answer is favorable or not favorable. So these are called Maurico Bone. They are basically fortune telling method developed in the Shang Dynasty. So something might be considered superstitious. Nonetheless, a lot of information about the Shang Dynasty court, the royal family, and their kind of state event were recorded on these auricle bones. Because when they ask a question, when they ask whether an expedition into the neighboring kingdom is auspicious on a certain day or not, then we know there is a certain name of a neighboring state, something like that. So we have a lot of detailed information. We got a lot of names of the royal family from the Shang Dynasty from these auricle bones. So Shang Dynasty, in another word, is unquestionably a historic period because we have written record like the auricle bone for these kind of crucial information about their the detail of their state and personal life. So it is also from these auricle bone we got the first glimpse into ancient Chinese writing. And we know that the script on the auricle bone, they are called auricle bone script or bone and shell script, 甲骨文 in Chinese. So those script are like, somewhat like the Egyptian hieroglyph. They are kind of a pictographic. A lot of those characters are pictographic. For example, this is a auricle bone writing for tiger, right? So this character means tiger, and it does look like a tiger. It's a simplified, kind of abstract picture of a tiger. Even though you need to look at it sideways. This is the body, this is the head, and the legs, and the tail, right? So it does look like some kind of beast, animal. And later, in the Zhou Dynasty, about 1000 year BCE, it is further simplified like that. That's a tiger from the Zhou Dynasty. And this is the way tiger is written from the Han Dynasty, and which is about 2000 years ago. This is like, 3,500 years ago. This is like, 3,000 years ago. This is like 2000 years ago. And after Tang Dynasty, the character is kind of standardized. This is like from the 6th century to to 9th century. And this is basically the same as the way we write the character today. So every Chinese character is developed from something like a little picture. So by looking at the Chinese writing, we got some insight into the thing it is depicting. And this is called paleography, right? So there are different ways, kind of cursive, more cursive way of writing the same character, but this is the evolvement of the Chinese character. So when we are looking at Shang Dynasty, then we look into the Shang Dynasty writing. So we got a pretty good idea about what the thing being depicted is like. For example, the Chinese character for foundation, 基 foundation. And this is the modern way of writing the character. So these are the Zhou Dynasty and the Zhou Dynasty way of writing it. But this is the way Shang Dynasty write ji or foundation. And you can see very clearly that a foundation, what a foundation mean 3,500 years ago in the Shang Dynasty. There is a pit, right? So obviously there is a pit. And in the pit is a column. And below that column, there is some kind of horizontal slab to support it. And behind it in the pit, it's some kind of stuffing material. So that's the foundation. That's how an architectural foundation, how a foundation of a building is constructed. And we see it very clearly in this old character, right? You dig a pit, you pave it with something, maybe you pound, you ram the dirt to be solid, and then you put a stone slab on top of that, solid bottom of the pit, and that stone slab is going to support a wooden pillar, and that is the foundation of Shang Dynasty architecture. So paleographical study give us a glimpse into the concept and sometimes even material of Shang Dynasty architecture. At Archaeology, the same place where the Xia Dynasty complex had been identified, some later complexes were identified with the early Shang Dynasty. For example, palace number 4. We talk about palace number 1, number 2. Those are before the Shang Dynasty. Whether or not they are Xia Dynasty is another question, but palace number 4 is dated from the early Shang Dynasty, somewhere around 1600 BCE. And this one, I don't want to spend a lot of time analyze it. You guys should be able to see those characteristic features as later traditional Chinese architecture, like symmetry, southern orientation, courtyard, main gate, axis, etc., and rectangular hall. What I wanted to show you is the actual look of the site in the field. So this is what archaeologists got for us. Basically, the dirt is cleared and those pits for the columns had been identified. And this confirmed the paleographical record about the base. Basically, we have those pits, and those are the places where wooden column that had been standing from, and those pits were identified on the archaeological site. And this also gives you a sense of those archaeological sites, where they are located. They are basically in the modern farmland, and archaeologists discovered something there and then revealed once upon a time, many thousand years ago, it was once the site for great palatial architecture for the rulers of the Shang Dynasty. So now let me give you another example of those old characters and what we might know from these old characters. So there are a lot of ancient Chinese words with kind of this kind of particle, this kind of parts. And some of them means wide, some of them means to expand, some of them means corridor, some of these characters means veranda. So I'm using one example, like the character for veranda called Wu is illustrated here. Again, this is a modern script, and this is the Han Dynasty script, and these are the Zhou Dynasty script, right? So I'm showing you a Zhou Dynasty script. The Zhou Dynasty script is about 500 years later than the Shang Dynasty. But I'm going to show you this one. And I want you to look really carefully. And now I'm going to also expand that character, right? So this character, it means veranda. And this time, I want to have a different form of discussion, in-class discussion. I'm not going to divide you guys into groups. Rather, I will just give you 2 minutes. 2 minutes, everyone think about it, 2 minutes. Look at this character and tell me, this character for veranda, what does this character suggest of the structure of a veranda in ancient China? Just by looking at it, imagine this is a little picture of a veranda, and how is a veranda being depicted in this ancient script, and what does it tell us? So I'm going to give you 2 minutes, and you can write down your answer, and after 2 minutes, it will be voluntary. So if you have an answer, you can just unmute yourself and speak up, right? So I'm going to give you 2 minutes.